Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jeff J. Brown, China Rising Radio Sinoland on the D-Day beaches of Normandy in France. And I am very honored and happy to have on the show today, Pat Shannon. How are you doing, Pat?
Hi. Hey, Jeff. Good to meet you finally.
Yeah, absolutely. Pat and I met because I published which I've been publishing for several years now, and I keep adding to it on the anniversary of the Oklahoma City terror attack, of the U.S. government terrorist attack in Oklahoma City. And he was very nice. He was very nice and sent me back a link to his website and the fact that he had a DVD. And so I got on his website and I saw, my gosh, this guy's an author and has done DVDs and apparently has his own publishing company. And I was very, very impressed, and I was impressed with the title of his books. So I said, "Hey, Pat, let's get you on the show and help share and help get the word out about the wonderful work you're doing." So thank you so much for being on again.
Yes, sir. Yeah, as I say, I'm happy to know you face to face finally.
And Pat, let me read his incredible biography. Pat Shannon's thirst for truth was set in motion more than a half a century ago when he began to examine the, quote, other side, end of quote, of the news of the JFK assassination, and it has never been quenched. Through the years, he discovered that Americans have seldom been told the whole truth about anything of consequence, such as the case with the current mainstream propaganda revolving around the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, the JFK assassination and uncensored story of the two Oswalds. As his book presents evidence, in fact, seldom heard or seen in print. His amateur sleuthing turned professional after the notorious 1983 federally sanctioned roof-out of Gordon Call by the FBI and U.S. Marshals in North Dakota and Arkansas. In the 1990s, Shannan was hired by Chuck Harder as investigative reporter for the People Radio Network and covered such high-profile cases as the federal attacks at Ruby Ridge, Waco, and on the Montana Freeman, as well as the huge FBI burial of the truth of the Oklahoma City bombing. You're lucky they didn't kill you, because several people have been killed for trying to tell the truth about that horrible terrorist act. Pat's 2-hour DVD documentary of these facts, Oklahoma City bombing, forerunner to 9/11, is still available. Washington, D.C. newspapers Spotlight and American Free Press and the national magazines Media Bypass and the Barnes Review carried his commentary and roving news reports for 3 decades. Well, you've been a journalist for 3 decades. Pat is the author of 9 books, and his 2011 revisionist history, Everything They Ever Told Me Was a Lie, that's for sure, covers the unknown facts of many of the deceptions perpetrated by the federal government and perpetrated by what he calls the CMM, the controlled mass media. Nice, I like that. His latest, Miracle in Atlanta, is his story of defeating the U.S. attorney in a full-blown 10-day criminal trial in Atlanta federal court by using a, quote, a fool for a client, end of quote, toward a happy ending. AFP wrote that Pat and Congressman Jim Traficant are the only people in its staff knew of that had beaten a conspiracy charge in federal court without a lawyer. So you are quite a fighter. I'm really impressed. I will include on our interview page his email and his website, which is called Independent News International. I also have the link for his books and DVD. And so let's get started, shall we?
Sure.
All right. Pat, if you were like me when what I was taught in school in the U.S. is not what I know now, please tell us about your arc of awareness. Was it a slow realization or a sudden epiphany? And at what stage in your life, what age?
Well, as you just read in a profile, I knew something was stinking bad about the JFK assassination. At that time, I was in my early 20s. But we had no way to learn anything else other than what the controlled mass media were telling us, like about Oswald, for instance. And they had concluded from the beginning that he had done it. And of course, you know, we all know now that how much of a patsy he actually was, as he claimed to have been. But along about 1966, 3 years after just being so perplexed, I came across a book called The Second Oswald. It was written by a man named Richard Popkin. He was no more of an investigator than I was at the time. He was a professor at San Diego State, but he was just perplexed, as so many of us were. And he got to snooping around and looking at various facts, and he uncovered, to me, the most impressive fact that just bugged me for a long time was, how can a 17-year-old kid growing up in New Orleans of all places, one of the most distinguishable territories in America for an accent, and how can a 17-year-old grow up in New Orleans and quit school and at 17 and join the Marines? And allegedly, we found out this part wasn't true either. It was part of the government's cover story, but allegedly went to language school for 6 weeks in Japan. And he comes out speaking Russian so eloquently that when he meets his future wife, Marina, a couple of years later in Russia, he speaks the language and so well, she thinks he's a native. There's something really wrong with that story. So that bugged me. It bugged Jim Mars, my late great friend, and 2 or 3 others that were writing about the case way back in the 70s, long before I ever penned a word. And about you asking when did I wake up, was I guess the first shining light would have been in 74. So I was in my mid-30s by then. And a friend of mine that I was in business with had also come across the John Birch Society, and there was a meeting going on. We were in Columbus, Georgia at the time. There was a meeting going on across the river and a little bit north up in Opelika, Alabama. So he wanted to take me and my wife along, and I said, yeah, sure, I'm interested. And that was, today we look at the Birch Society as great elementary education. And that's I think they confuse a lot of people along the way. But initially, it was also a great mind opener, and if they're trying to be controlled opposition, they goof it up at the front end because they get too many people such as I that become enough interested in the truth that we go beyond their stuff. But they had great books. There's some other initial stuff that I read in the beginning. You just opened my eyes, and Gary Allen's book back then that he sold 1 trillion copies of was a great one on the whole world control. But that's when I began to read, and you wonder what are we learning now that we never learned in school? Well, we didn't learn a whole lot in school either, even back in the 50s when I was there. But we knew about the Constitution, but we never studied it. And so there's a great change today. I mean, what we're seeing that parents are cursing the schools for doing now is disgusting. But my real education began in my 30s when I became a reader, and then in 1980 I had the great fortune to meet a man by the name of F. Tupper Saussy, and he a remarkable guy who also became interested in the truth in middle age, and Tupper has written some great books, but his book, the Miracle on Main Street, he called it, was a great expose that a 9th grade kid could understand on the Federal Reserve and the money. It's just the greatest educational thing because a 9th grader can understand it. But and that's when I began to learn where the real source of power was of the enemy against us. And here it had been going on since the first bank opened in early 1914. So now it's well over a century, 100 years now. But that's where the power is when, just as Rothschild said, give me the control of a nation's monetary supply, and I care not who makes its laws, because I'm in control. And we have seen that. I'd say the world has begun to wake up, I think, just in the last 5 years since Trump began to expose so much about fake news. He woke up a lot of sleeping people, I believe. And his I don't know how to say it, but his stand, is he controlled opposition? Well, many are beginning to think so with the way he treated the vaccine. I mean, that was very, very questionable on that situation. But nevertheless, we certainly have to admit that the 4 years he was in there, it certainly was better for us than the previous 100, for sure. So, yes, I began to get my education by reading in the 70s and then hooking up with Tupper Saussy, and he and I traveled and spoke together at various places around the country, and I just became his sidekick. And,
how do you spell his last name?
Saussy, Saussy. There's my book called I Rode with Tupper.
I Rode with Tupper. Okay, I saw that on your website, but I didn't know who he was.
Okay. Well, his book, The Miracle on Main Street, was so well accepted back in the 80s that he opened up a newspaper in a little town in Sewanee, Tennessee, and began to publish the Main Street Journal. And it was very, very popular. And in fact, it became so popular that the feds began to keep an eye on him. And in 1987, he was contacted by a man named James Earl Ray. Do you recognize that name?
Mm-hmm.
Well, James was there in Nashville, Tennessee, in the penitentiary. He was framed for the murder of Martin Luther King, for your listeners who don't recognize it.
Yeah, we all know that.
Yeah, well, Ray saw that here was an honest man. I don't know how he was became active. I'm sure he wasn't subscribing to the paper, but when Tupper began to get attacked by the feds, when he hadn't broken any laws, all he had done was tell the truth. Ray began to see his name in the national newspapers, and he finally wrote Tupper a letter. He said, "Here's an honest newsman. Here's one I can trust." Because from that time, since '68, every time, or I should say since '69 when Ray got jailed, every time a parole hearing would be coming up, the news media would come after it. And it would be Time and Newsweek and the New York Times and everybody that had any big circulation was just destroying any chance that Ray might have had for a second trial. Then suddenly he discovered Tupper Saussy. Well, here's a newsman I can trust. So he wrote Tupper a letter. And he said, "I'd like to tell my story. You seem like the publisher to do it." And the Tupper went to see him, and driving up to Nashville for a couple of hours from Sewanee, he was thinking all the way, "What am I crazy? What am I doing? I'm going to see the convicted murderer of the civil rights hero. Am I serious?" And he kept talking to himself, and it was always amusing to hear him tell me his story. But then he began to realize when he met Ray, the sincerity of the man, and he gave him his manuscript, and he saw what the true story was. So Tupper published what he called Tennessee Waltz, and that came from one step forward and one step back with Tennessee and the federal government on James Earl Ray. And the Tennessee Waltz was the forerunner to the murder of Martin Luther King that was stolen from him a few years later and republished by someone else because Tupper was forced to go on the lam. And in 1987, he was ordered, because he had lost an appeal on 1 year of willful failure to file, and so he went to the penitentiary where he was ordered to report on or before April the 10th, 1987. And he took along a friend who had a video camera, and he stood at the penitentiary and read the sheet. "This order tells me that I'm to report to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary on or before April the 10th. Well, here I am, penitentiary. The penitentiary is not responding, so I'm leaving. They haven't come to get me." So he turned around and he sent the video to the judge in Chattanooga, who went through the roof. And Tupper ended up being on the lam for the next 10 and a half years.
Wow.
And it was during that time that I became his window to the world.
Oh, wow.
Slipping him some money in this now and then and whatever. So that's when, after about 5 years of those 10, I decided I need to write I Rode with Tupper. And it has a double connotation in that I rode with him because he led me to on the money issue on the education. But I also rode with him in his car and out in Utah and Arizona, Nevada, where he was on the lam when I was out there visiting with him during the late season.
What happened at the end?
At the end, a dirty turncoat patriot, a guy by the name of Grant McEwen. I love to publicize his name. He was a so-called patriot in Florida, and then he got in trouble, and he went to the feds, and he had, a long story, but he had been with Tupper, and so he told the feds where Tupper was in order to get a better deal for himself. But Grant's own brother has disowned him. He said, "What a turncoat." And today when I say, "How's your brother doing?" he say, "Oh, what brother?" And but anyway, Tupper got turned in, and he ended up giving him an extra year for escape, and that was in early '81. And when he got out, and that's when he was in there during the 10 years he was traveling, he was garnering all the information for the book that he wrote on the murders of evil. The Rulers of Evil is the name of it, and he exposed who the real problem is behind the scenes. And Rulers of Evil is a collector's item now because we're not a whole lot of them in print, but I think it's on the books. I think it was for a couple of $100 now. But a very valuable piece. So Tupper was a great intellectual, and in '07 he was in his apartment in Nashville, and a strange situation. He was found at his computer, and no autopsy was done. Well, as I'm sure you know, and I guess every state in the union, that whenever someone dies not under a doctor's care or dies alone, it's a law that they must do an autopsy. But I figured that at least two agencies in this country that could prevent that. One would be the FBI, and another would be the CIA, by putting the right kind of pressure on the medical examiner. And so, to me, I think that knowing what we know now about the directed energy weapons and other stuff that they can do, shoot through a wall, and I've always suspected that he was murdered.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. He was obviously a brave man who paid a price.
And he was only 70.
Yeah, that's sad. You have written several books and produced documentaries that I'd like to share with the fans. The first one is Everything They've Ever Told Me Was a Lie. Please tell us about it.
Well, here's what it looks like, but you may recognize that background. That's a school book depository in Dallas. And those are all the former presidents over the years, all the way back to Roosevelt, who've been lying to the American people. And one woman, I remember, I was doing a radio show in Florida, and she looked at that and she said, "Did you interview all these people?" I was 5 years old when Roosevelt was president. When he died. So anyway, I thought that would make a very interesting cover for the title. Everything they ever told me was a lie, and they're the liars. This book is a lot about a lot of famous cases, like JFK. But a lot of facts are in here that the average person doesn't know. And of course, there's still must be close to half the population out there, Jeff, who still believes Oswald did it and acted alone. And you see these questions on the net all the time. Did Oswald act alone? And I'm the first one to say, no, he didn't even act. He didn't fire a shot. And the test on the bullet powder on his hands proved that later. What do you call that test? I forget offhand. But anyway, some situations there. Well, like with the case I just told you about the two Oswalds, and the fact that here's one that spoke fluent Russian, and he quit high school in New Orleans and when he was 17. But here is what the first one I think of when somebody asks me, what's your book about? I think of the Robert F. Kennedy murder.
Mm-hmm.
I think I have it marked here. Yeah, here, you may not remember, but in 1969, when Oswald was on trial, he smelled a rat. He saw how his lawyers were selling him out, and he tried to fire his lawyer right there in the middle of the courtroom, and the judge wouldn't let him do it. Well, we learned much later that the lawyer was a popular guy from Los Angeles, but he had gotten in trouble with the Bar Association and was used the courts used him to sell out Sirhan in order to clean his record and make him a friend of the court again. But here's a piece that put on some extra things since I don't have much light here. At the trial, there was well, first of all, let me point out that Sirhan was never closer than 3 or 4 feet, witnesses said, to Bobby Kennedy, and he was always in front of him. So he'd be looking at him like I'm looking at you. But yet, when they did the autopsy, Bobby was shot behind the ear twice. He was shot in the back. One went through the tuck of his coat, another one in his back. So he was shot 4 times from the rear. Sirhan fired and emptied his gun, I guess, and hit like, I think it was 5 other people in the room, and they all survived, but there were bullet holes in the ceiling. The FBI found 13 bullet holes, and Sirhan had an 8-shot Ivory Johnson 22 pistol. So it was obvious that the frame was in. Well, further to that, come trial, and here's a piece that few people know, but a guy by the name of Dwayne Wolfer. He was the LAPD's criminologist, and he testified under oath that, where was he? Testified under oath that he had personally test-fired the weapon, an Ivory Johnson 22 revolver with the serial number, get this, H18602, and had found it to be the weapon that had fired the bullets that had been removed from Kennedy's neck and several other victims. However, says Shannon now, the serial number on Sirhan's Ivory Johnson was H, not 18602, but 53725, and not one member of the defense team caught it. And you know they had to have that right at their table. Mm-hmm. And just sort of little details like that are involved. One that some conservatives won't like is a chapter I wrote on Ronald Reagan and all his former leftist beliefs before he became a conservative Republican. Mm-hmm. The table of contents here, just to bring my own memory back. Oh, John Hinckley and George H.W. Bush. Yeah. Well, first of all, on that, I believe that was a Monday that marks the 30th of 1981, the first few weeks of Reagan's administration, is when he was shot. And well, of course, we're not even sure he was shot now. But that night, John Chancellor had on the NBC TV the very interesting tidbit that John Hinckley Jr.'s older brother by the name of Scott was friends with George Bush's son in Denver. In fact, they had a dinner engagement that very night. Wow. What are the odds, huh? So Jack Hinckley, it turns out, was George Bush's close buddy. They had done oil. That's Jack Hinckley being John Sr. And they had done oil deals together. But John Chancellor never mentioned that again. He got quashed right quick. Yeah. And
too close for comfort.
Yeah. But these are the sorts of little tidbits that are in here. What everything they ever told me was a lie. It was just accenting the title.
And you wrote a whole book about the JFK assassination and the uncensored story of the 2 Oswalds. Is there anything else you can add about that that you talked about?
Why, sure. In fact, to me, one of the most interesting things about the story was the two mothers. I'm looking for their pictures here, but have a look at those two women. Now, the older one is the one that America knew from the news. The lady on the left was Lee's mother. In fact, you can see how much she looks like him, or he like her. The lady on the right was the one who posed as Marguerite Oswald because she was Harvey's adopted mother. And all of this information was dug up by a guy named John Armstrong, and I give him credit throughout the book. But mine is the Reader's Digest version of his 1,000-page.
Oh my gosh!
Epic, and all of the details he came out with. But even if you look at those two guys, do they look like the same to you?
No,
not to me. Well, so his book was Harvey and Lee. Was the name of his 1,000-pager, and mine is a 160-pager Reader's Digest version that makes it a whole lot easier for people to dig it out. But Marguerite was born in 92. Lee Harvey Oswald was born in 39. That makes her 47 years old when she had that kid, if she did. Well, Lee's real mother, the one we showed you a minute ago, she was born in 07. So, she'd have been 32 in 39.
Yeah, that's more reasonable.
But the story of the two Oswalds, everybody that researchers on the case over the years still wants to fight off the fact that there were two Oswalds. And all the proof is right there. The Armstrong did such a great job of research. Now, Jim Mars was on my side with that. He said there's no doubt there were two. And, of course, he knew Armstrong. And have another friend in Tulsa, an investigator who was on the case as well, Craig Roberts, and he lived down the street from Armstrong. And he saw him doing research and lying there on the carpet with papers all over the floor for a couple of years. But Armstrong was a retired oil man and very wealthy. So he had the funds to be able to travel the world and do this research and talk with people. And he even looked up Oswald's stepbrother, the oldest one, and in Florida, and he refused to talk with him. But he went all over. The world interviewing people and did a remarkable job. So anyway, that's what that book is all about. And there's not any doubt that there were two Oswalds. There was a Lee and there was a Harvey. But once again, the most outstanding distinguishing factor of that is the one when he meets Marina and she thinks he's a native because he spoke Russian so fluently.
Wow. Unbelievable. Well, I found out, unfortunately, rather late, and I can't remember who it was that put me onto it, but I had just finished writing my book, China Rising, where I spend the first 100 pages exposing all these false flags to show how what we see in the West is basically a mirage. And I didn't find out about it until afterwards, but tell us about your DVD, Oklahoma City bombing and the forerunner to 9/11.
Well, once again, it was Chuck Harder and the People's Radio Network that sent me and the film team out to Oklahoma City very early in the game. We started filming in August, and of course the bombing wasn't until April the 19th. So just a few months in, we were already filming this video, and we took, I had a half a dozen trips out to Oklahoma City, but we also went to Las Vegas and put Ted Gunderson on with us because he had been on the case, and that's when he and I first met and became friends for the rest of his life, the next 20 years. But so the film we did was really quite an expose of what the world did not know. But even though we were so early in the game, we didn't know then nearly what we know now. But we did have the pleasure and the privilege of meeting with General Ben Parton. Do you remember that name?
Yeah. He's the one that has that famous quote. Yeah. Go ahead.
I thought you were going to give me the quote because I wasn't sure which one you meant.
No, but no, this is your show.
Okay. Well, Ben and I met, and we got him on the video. We caught up with him in Albuquerque. He was doing a talk out there, and we had just been in Las Vegas with Ted Gunderson, and so it was an easy stop to come through and catch him there. And that's where we videoed his part. And he had a very interesting story to tell, not only educational, because he was, in the week after the bombing, he was with his wife at his home in Alexandria, Virginia, and looking at nothing more than Time and Newsweek and U.S. News and World Report and all the national magazines, and he's looking at the pictures there, and he says to his wife, "This is a bunch of baloney." He said, "There was no ANFO bomb that did this damage. These columns were blown from the inside." He could see that from photographs. Well, why wouldn't he? He's had 25 years, 30 years in the military and the Air Force, and now as a brigadier general, he had 25 of those. He even taught at one of the war colleges on demolition. The guy was an expert. If anybody wanted to know, if the government wanted to know what happened in Oklahoma City, Ben Parton should have been the first one they would have called. Which reminds me, a few years later, he was in his home and the trial was coming up. First of all, they illegally, unconstitutionally moved that trial out of Oklahoma to Denver, when it's supposed to be tried within the confines of the state where the crime took place. But they knew too many people in Oklahoma knew the truth. And also, thanks to Pat Shannon's video, that didn't hurt any either with the Oklahomans. But Ben had exposed on there when he came down to meet. He didn't come to meet us. He didn't even know us. We caught up with him later. But he came to Oklahoma at his own expense to meet with the fire department, where they showed him a couple of hundred more pictures, other pictures, and that's where he could determine what happened. Also, not only showing that the ANFO bomb blowing up on the street inward was impossible because the walls were blown out. There's an insurance company across the street where a guy was on, I believe it was the third floor. I talked to him later, but from the nursery, you remember where all the kids and babies were killed? There was a doll, a child's doll had blown out of the Murrah building, out the window and into his window across the street. Now, how did an ANFO bomb in a truck
blowing into the building, the Murrah building,
and sitting between the two buildings do that? So these are the things that Ben was showing, and he then. I was going to tell you that a few years later, I think it was like 2000, when they're coming up with this trial, eventually took place in Denver in 2001. But where they're trying Tim McVeigh, and he gets a visit. He gets a visit not from the. Is that you or me?
No, it's not. Keep going.
Okay, he gets a visit from the defense team. Stephen Jones's team. Stephen wasn't there, but I think 3 other lawyers on his team came to Virginia to meet with Ben Parton and get his story, and he told the whole story. And they were there for an hour or more, he told me. And when they were leaving, he said, "Well, are you guys going to call me for trial?" And the response was, that depends on what Beth says. Beth, I forget her last name now. She just hit the news recently when she became Kavanaugh's defense attorney on the Supreme Court. Okay. But Beth at that time was a federal prosecutor, and the defense team is telling Ben Parton that it depends on what the federal prosecutor says whether we call you or not. Is the fix in, Jeff, or what?
Yeah. Well, he was a patsy, just like Oswald, and just like James Earl Ray, and just like Sirhan, and they find these guys, and
you reminded me. Yeah, that reminds me, because for about 5-6 years after the bombing, before the alleged execution, we always thought just what you said, that he was a patsy being led around by his nose. He had no visible means of support, and obviously where somebody was funding him, and it certainly appeared to be the patsy until they convicted him and the execution took place in Terre Haute, Indiana. Now, Terre Haute is one of the big super duper execution centers, but the executioner they brought in came from Langley, Virginia. Does that place sound familiar? So now, why do they need him? Well, maybe just to fake an execution. Well, as that I reminded myself, I'm pretty sure this is why the government over the years got away from hangings and went to the needle. It's pretty dang hard to fake a hanging. So, but here they're leading him out, and 2 or 3 reporters are outside, and one is this female reporter from WLS Radio in Chicago who happens to be live, so they can't kill her report later. And she says, well, yeah, there's McVeigh on the gurney, and why he's still breathing. And a couple of other reporters wrote it themselves, but of course that was easy enough for them to quash. But her live report was heard all over the country by thousands of people, millions of people, 50,000 screaming watch coming out of Chicago.
So, it's a big radio station. It's huge.
Yeah. And so I talked to my buddy Craig Roberts about that, who's once again was on top of the Oklahoma City bombing along with me for years, and it took him about a day and a half to figure out that the FBI was behind it and doing all the big cover up. But I talked to Craig about it, and he said, "Well, here's how it works." And I wrote a piece about it, and somebody posted it on the net. If you want to pull it up, you'll find a quite interesting scenario on what Craig proposed on what actually happened with that fake execution. But he says, bottom line is that they have to protect their own like this, Pat, because they've got dozens of them around the world, and those people are doing the same thing that the McVeigh is, and they're in abeyance, held for whatever is necessary down the road. Just like they knew who Oswald was in 1953. They didn't use him for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So Craig went on to explain to me, and it made a lot of sense, that they have to protect their own, and that's why McVeigh is still alive, because the other teammates around the world have to know that when they get in that situation, they're paid to go to jail. They're paid to pay the sentence or whatever they have to do. They're going to be paid for that well, and they're going to get sprung soon. But you can't kill them. You must not kill them, because then you're going to kill your whole team.
That's really interesting. I will buy the video. I know you have a special deal on your website if you buy 2 or 3 different things. You get a special 7 things. Yeah,
7 books and 2 videos for $99.
Yeah. I'm going to do that, and we're going to go back to Oklahoma for Christmas because we just had our first grandchild. And so we want to go back and see our new granddaughter. And so when I'm back, and I won't have to pay the international postage, I'll order them when I go back for.
I was just going to suggest that. Let me send it to you in Oklahoma, because the international rates are outrageous. I had a friend who ordered my last book, The Miracle in Atlanta, and it's in hardcover, and it's thick and it's heavy, and it sold for $30 in the U.S. and that's delivered. $25 plus shipping and handling. The cost $63 for me to get it to him in England.
But it's a good book.
It better be.
Well, before we leave, what book writing and DVD projects do you have in the works now?
Well, I write occasional magazine articles. I'm semi-retired. I guess one of these, you can't quit, and you're never going to quit either when it comes to this.
I keep working. I keep cranking stuff out.
I have a couple of sources. The Barnes Review is one of the few places left for truth, and I do magazine articles for them on occasion. And I used to write for American Free Press, but I quit that a few years ago, and mainly because some of these bigger cases that come up, I would love to go visit and investigate and hang around for a week or two. It's too doggone expensive when you don't have a Chuck Harder to pay your way, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Pat, this has been a lot of fun. This has been very revealing. I'm really pleased to meet you and meet a soulmate and search for the truth and justice and it's just I think the hardest thing for Westerners is to realize just how awful our governments are, and they are absolutely evil. And the United States is right up there, right up there with them, especially since the end of World War II. And it's just horrible. And so people like you expose the truth, and you use facts and research and background and witnesses and everything else. And so it's very, very impressive. So I will order your stuff when I go back this Christmas, and I'll ask my family to make that the 2 DVDs and the 7 books a Christmas gift for me for Christmas. How's that sound?
Okay, that'll be great. Yeah.
So nice to have met you, Pat. And as soon as I get this out, again, if you want to go to, I will put on his where you can buy all of his books. I will put and DVDs. I will put his website, which is called Independent News International, where he posts stuff, and I'll put his email so that you can contact him for any kind of follow-up. Thank you so much, Pat. Really enjoyed having you on the phone.
Let me put in that Independent News International. Actually, the site is ini-world-report.org.
There you go. Thank you very much.
But you'll post it too, I hope.
Absolutely, and I'll send you the link when it's done.
Okay.
All right, maybe, and then you can put our interview on your website.
Yeah.
All right.
Put up your site and stuff as well.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Take care.
You too.